Welcome to On Health with Houston Methodist. I'm Zach Moore. I'm a photographer and editor here, and I've worked in multimedia and television for over 15 years, and I'm also a longtime podcaster.
I'm Katie McCallum. I'm a former researcher turned health writer, mostly writing for our blog.
Katie, how hydrated do you think you are?
I think generally I'm pretty hydrated. I don't think that's always been the case. In my 20s, I probably did not drink enough water. I would maybe have a glass or two a day. It was pretty bad.
Only a glass or two of water a day.
Yeah.
You are familiar, you're supposed to take 8 glasses of water a day.
I wasn't
An apple a day keeps the doctor away, and you should drink 8 glasses of water. Everybody knows this.
As they say. I grew up like this. And it's funny, my dad's the same way. We just don't think to drink water. I did eventually at some point realize that I needed to increase my water intake dramatically. And I think it became this thing of if it's out of sight, out of mind. So instead, I just bought myself a water bottle and made myself carry it around everywhere. And now I drink plenty now, actually. And I enjoy drinking water now.
Yeah, water, it's like when you're a kid, I don't know, I felt this way. It's like, oh, we're just going to drink water. Like you go to a restaurant, you're like, we're all having water. And you feel like, oh man, I wanted a Coke, right? So it's like you're going to treat yourself to a different kind of drink. But no, water really is the best thing you should be drinking. I mean, our bodies are, 90% water?
I think it's like 60-ish.
Oh, okay.
So 90 might be.
I thought we were like 90% water. Is the Earth 90% water?
I think it's 70.
Man, where's the 90% come from? Anyway,
we'll have to fact check me on all of this too. So
ultimately, we're over half water is what I'm trying to say, our body composition. So it's naturally that we want to replenish that, right? Especially when it's hot. Think about it. Like when you're out there sweating, that water's coming from somewhere and you need to replenish that. Especially when it's hot, like it has been this past year.
That's right.
And, I have adopted drinking water pretty much, not continuously all day long, but, I spend a lot of time at a desk editing, things like that. I try to have a glass of water there, continually refill it, and just stay hydrated.
Yeah. I think it's something that if you're not focusing on, or for some people, myself, I think I was one of them, if you're not focusing on staying hydrated, it's something to lose track of. And still to this day, I'll lose track of it. There's some days where I'm just really busy, or if my routine is off, it'll be 11 or lunchtime and I'll realize like, wow, I haven't had a single drop of water yet today. And we're going to learn about what that means for our hydration status. Today, we're going to talk about a lot of hydration topics. We actually pack a lot into this episode, so I think it's going to be pretty fun for people. We get a pretty good base about hydration, dehydration, all the basics you need to know. And then we also start talking about hydration products, powders you can put into your water that are packed with electrolytes, and sports drinks, and how we all sweat differently and what that means for our electrolyte levels. So I think there's a lot to hydration, and we cover a lot today with Emma Willingham, who's one of our clinical dietitians here at Houston Methodist.
Excellent. Let's get into it.
I'm here with Emma Willingham, a clinical dietitian at Houston Methodist who's board certified in sports dietetics. Hi, Emma.
Hello. Thanks for having me. This is so fun.
Yeah, of course. We've worked together a lot for the blog.
Yes.
I think this is the first time we've met in person.
I know. That's crazy. We started working together during COVID, so all of our meetings were Teams meetings.
Yes. Yeah. It's nice to see your face in 3D.
Yes. You as well.
Cool. So we have you here today to talk about hydration. And I think, we all know we need to drink water, but there seems to be an interest in hydration and the wellness space more and more these days. Their products, their services, and we'll get to those. But wanted to start with just a simple hydration question. We've all heard 8 glasses of water a day. Is this right? Is that too little?
That's a really great general recommendation. Normally, to personalize it and individualize the recommendation a little bit more, I usually tell people to aim for half of their body weight in ounces. So whatever that number is, just cut it in half, and that's the amount of ounces of water you should be drinking a day. 64 ounces, though, is a great place to start, or the 8 cups of water, especially if somebody feels like they don't drink enough water, and, kind of try to get to that benchmark first, and then we can individualize it a little bit more.
I personally carry a water bottle around everywhere. I have mine here, so I don't really think of it in cups. I guess I think of it in maybe like liters and things like that. So you can crunch the numbers unless you have it on the top of your head. But for somebody who carries a water bottle around, is that 2 bottles of water a day?
If you're using a reusable water bottle, usually those are about 32 ounces on average. So you'd want to aim for 2 of those water bottles, the reusable ones, per day. I usually recommend filling it up once in the morning, drinking throughout the morning 32 ounces, and then refilling and then drinking the other 32 in the afternoon. If you're somebody who usually uses the more standard water bottle sizes that you would get in a pack from the store, that would be about 16 to 17 ounces. So you would want to aim for 4 of those a day.
And so that's actually a perfect segue for my next question. So you mentioned maybe having 1 bottle or 2 bottles if it's the smaller ones in the morning, then the afternoon, repeat. So need to be dispersing this total water content throughout the day. It sounds like I can't just, at 7 p.m. say, oh, dang, I haven't had much water. Let me chug another bottle or so. Maybe not as helpful.
Right, exactly. Yes, you want to spread it out throughout the day. Kind of similar to the way that we want to spread out other nutrients like protein or carbs. We want to try to get those things at every single meal. Similar with water. I usually say try to aim for like a cup of water an hour. It is a little bit harder to make up for lost time later in the day. I think that we're all guilty of that at some level, just because, you're working and the day gets away from you and you're like, oh my gosh, it's 2 p.m. and I haven't had any water today. So sometimes it's a little inevitable, but it is best to spread it out as well as you can.
Yeah, I think especially with traveling, I just traveled, and when I travel, I'm in an airport, I literally don't think I drink water whatsoever. So those are kind of those days where I wonder, am I mildly dehydrated at this point? And so I guess the next question really is, when we talk about mild dehydration, or, if you just haven't had enough water solely in a single day, what are the effects of that? Is it maybe things you can't quite tell, or could it be headaches and things like that?
Yeah, it can be a mixture of things. It can feel similar to when you feel low energy kind of from not eating, in a long time. So a lot of people will start to feel headaches. They'll feel general fatigue, maybe dry mouth. It might be hard to concentrate. And sometimes we attribute that to not eating, but it might actually be lack of water, lack of fluids too. Another tricky one is that sometimes when you're dehydrated, it can actually manifest as feeling hungry. So that, makes it a little bit more complicated as well. So it's important to really listen to your body and really be aware of what you have been drinking throughout the day. And when you start to feel a little bit off, think about, okay, have I been drinking water? If so, when, how much, all of those questions.
Yeah, definitely guilty, I think, of maybe seeming like I'm hungry and having a snack instead of water. So you're a proponent of if you're hungry and it's not mealtime, have a couple sips of water first and see if it dissipates?
Yeah. I mean, see if you think back to what you've been doing kind of earlier in the day. If you get to, mid-afternoon and you're like, wow, I'm really hungry, but I just ate lunch not that long ago, it might be water that you actually need, but, kind of try to assess it in the scheme of your overall day.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then beyond someone's overall day, what do we need to know about dehydration kind of in this larger context of maybe you're a person who regularly does not drink enough water? What are some of the kind of effects that can come out of that?
I think one of the most significant ones is that it can strain your organs, just because your organs need that fluid to be able to work efficiently and optimally. And then that can then manifest in your just day-to-day routine and kind of the way that you operate, your productivity, things like that. And a lot of it is kind of what you were mentioning earlier, things that we might not even realize. There was a really interesting study that was done analyzing dehydration when it comes to the effects of driving. So it actually, the researchers found that people who were dehydrated had slower reaction time when they were driving. They were less likely to, pay attention to the road as well. And so that was a really good example of just the little things that we do on a daily basis that can be impacted by dehydration.
Yeah. So almost like an equivalent to being hangry, when you're hungry and you get kind of irritated, maybe it's, if you're mildly dehydrated, your productivity goes down and maybe your reaction time. So it's interesting.
Definitely.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's very interesting.
Okay. Interesting. For more obvious symptoms of dehydration, are there some ways people can easily tell that, okay, I'm dehydrated, it's time to really focus on water?
Yeah, there are 2 ways that you can really measure or visually see how dehydrated you are or the impacts of that dehydration. One of those is going to be just assessing the color of your urine. So the more clear it is, the more hydrated you are. If you start to creep into like the, apple juice, darker looking category, TMI, but it's helpful. That's when we are like, okay, we need to really bump up the water intake and prioritize hydration a little bit more. Another way too is weighing yourself before and after you exercise. So if you weigh yourself before you, for example, go on a run or a bike ride, and then weigh yourself after when you get back, however many pounds of water you lost or pounds of weight, that is measured on the scale, you would want to replace that with about 16 to 20 ounces of water. So that can really tell you in real time, okay, wow, I lost this much fluid. I need to replace it.
Yeah, that also sounds interesting too, because it's just that reminder that, man, you really can lose a pound of weight just from water alone and maybe a long workout or something. Mm-hmm. It's a nice reminder of how important that is.
Yes, and how easily it can be lost.
Yeah,
definitely.
Water isn't the only thing we lose as we exercise, or do anything that causes us to sweat for that matter. Electrolytes are lost too. These are essential minerals that, among other important roles they play in our body, go hand in hand with hydration. One of these electrolytes in particular, sodium, is key in helping us hold on to water and maintain optimal fluid balance. This means that we need to replace the sodium and other electrolytes we lose throughout the day, especially after sweating, in order to prevent dehydration. Fortunately, these minerals are fairly abundant in the foods we eat. But you can also get electrolytes from certain beverages, something that will come up a lot throughout the rest of Emma and Katie's conversation.
What are some of the things, even if we are drinking enough water, are there things that can dehydrate us on top of the water we're already getting?
One thing that is a little bit controversial is caffeine intake. So some people will say, oh, caffeine is very dehydrating. Some people count, sources of caffeine like coffee or tea as fluid intake. I'm kind of in the middle. I kind of feel like it depends on, where the caffeine is coming from, how much you're having, that kind of thing. Like if you're having a cup of coffee or tea, that could probably contribute to better hydration. But if you're just pounding coffee all day long, that's probably going to put you in a deficit when it comes to water balance. Alcohol, we know, is also very dehydrating, and hence the reason why a lot of people reach for, Pedialyte or liquid IV or things like that to kind of help counteract some of those effects.
Yeah, absolutely. What about really salty foods? Is that just a thirst to kind of help us drink, or are we actually dehydrating ourselves at that point when we have a really salty meal?
Yeah, so the salty food, like salted nuts or, I think of soy sauce, something like that, that won't necessarily make you dehydrated, but it will trigger that thirst mechanism, which is why a lot of electrolyte supplements are really helpful because, if you have somebody exercising, for example, the salt that's in those electrolyte supplements will actually kind of induce them to drink more water. So that's what happens with the salty snacks. They will add more sodium to your bloodstream, which will then create that effect, but they won't dehydrate you in the same way that, not drinking fluid does.
We've covered a lot of the hydration basics at this point. Up after the break, we'll talk about products claiming they hydrate better than water, how we all sweat differently, and what this means for how we rehydrate. When exactly you should choose a sports drink over water, and even whether the pH of your water matters.
From annual checkups to managing chronic conditions, your healthcare should be personalized to you. At Houston Methodist, our primary care doctors provide customized care for you and your family, with more than 40 convenient locations across Greater Houston. We offer a variety of ways to get care, from in-person and virtual appointments to same-day visits when you're sick. Choose your doctor and schedule online at houstonmethodist.org/stayhealthy. Houston Methodist, leading medicine.
Back to dehydration, or maybe even just the average person who isn't even dehydrated, is otherwise healthy. There's a lot of products out there to help us stay hydrated. And the one that I'm thinking of in my mind, there's sports drinks. Those have existed for a long time. They were designed with a very particular purpose. I think we'll get to those actually in a minute. But
sure.
Before we get to those, the thing I've noticed recently is these packets that, have solutions in them or powders that claim to hydrate better than water, quote unquote. So does an otherwise healthy person who, whether they're getting quite enough water or not, do they ever need to be hydrated better than what water can hydrate you?
Yes. So It's very situational and could create like a tree of decision making when it comes to hydration products and things that can help in addition to just your regular water intake. The main things that would increase your fluid needs or need for some of these other products would be the environment that you're in, if you're exercising, if you're somebody that sweats a lot. So if you are somebody that is exercising, right now outside in Houston when it's 120 degrees, very humid, you're probably going to be losing a lot of salt through your sweat. And so in that case, we need to replenish what was lost, which is when some of those other products can come in handy. If those products are being used more for somebody who's pretty sedentary, they're working inside all day, not exercising a lot, those things are probably not as helpful. They are adding more salt to your bloodstream and increasing your blood pressure and things like that. But if they're used carefully and considering, other environmental factors such as heat, humidity, exercise, the length and duration of your exercise, they can be helpful.
Okay, so these hydration multipliers maybe even kind of have some detrimental effects in some cases. So they're not even just not beneficial, they might even be kind of excessive to the point of harm.
Yes, if they're being used incorrectly or when they're not needed. For example, some of those products can have up to 500 milligrams of sodium in them, which is pretty substantial if you're not losing that sodium through sweat or, other losses. And so it's important to use those for the purpose that they were created. Part of the enticement too, I think, is that a lot of them taste really good and they have good flavors, which then makes you want to drink more, in addition to the sodium making you want to drink more. So there's a lot of factors that can go into it. But yes, if they're not used for the purpose that they were created, they can actually do more harm than good.
To understand why we should take Emma's warning seriously, it helps to understand what happens in your body when you take in more salt than you actually need, whether that's through incorrectly using hydration packets or just eating a really salty meal. Your kidneys are always helping balance the amount of sodium in your body, retaining what you need and filtering out what you don't. They can get overwhelmed when large, unnecessary amounts of salt are consumed though. Excess sodium that your kidneys struggle to filter builds up in your bloodstream, which your body then tries to dilute with water. This increases your blood volume, causing your heart to pump harder and increasing the pressure in your arteries, hence the increased blood pressure Emma mentioned. This increased pressure places stress on the blood vessels in every organ of your body. It's why consuming too much salt can, over time, cause a range of health issues, including high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, and kidney disease.
You've mentioned sodium and sweat now, and it reminds me of a conversation you and I have had while talking about some blog posts. And I don't think we ever actually turned this into a blog post yet, so this is perfect that this is coming up on the pod. Sweat. We sweat out electrolytes, namely sodium.
Yes.
But I remember you telling me one time that everybody sweats differently,
yes.
and not even just the amount. We all sweat out different levels of these electrolytes. Can you talk us through that a little bit more? And I found that so fascinating when you talked about it last.
Yes, it's super interesting. So the main electrolytes that we, have in our body is their sodium, chloride, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And a lot of times with electrolyte products, and when someone is assessing how much they're sweating, they think that they need to replace, all of those electrolytes. But in actuality, the majority of the electrolytes that we lose through sweat are going to be primarily sodium and then a little bit of chloride. And then even with that, each person and each individual, loses different concentrations of those electrolytes through their sweat. So you might have somebody who is a really, really salty sweater. They exercise outside and you can see the salt collecting on their clothes or the rim of their hat. Whereas another individual might be doing the exact same activity in the same environment. They're also sweating a lot, but they might be losing only water and not as much sodium. So that's where, there are some new techniques and research and things like that have been focusing specifically on that topic and how to address, individualized sweat concentration. And it's really interesting, who would have thought that there could be a whole research topic on just sweat.
Yeah. When you brought
Sweat
it up,
content.
I found it so interesting. And I've seen athletes will have their specific, you can tell they have a specific mix that they're drinking or a specific bottle. And I think that probably explains it. And I have seen those services where you can test your sweat.
Yes.
And some of it is, I don't really necessarily probably need to worry about it too much, but as a person who finds it interesting and likes like data information about myself, I'm always so tempted to be like, ooh, do I sweat out more sodium or do I sweat out, less potassium than most people?
Yeah. And it can be helpful too, because I mean, there might be somebody who they're exercising and they're sweating a lot. It might not even be a huge amount of activity. They just are a heavy sweater and they might feel like, oh, I really don't need an electrolyte supplement, or I'm good with just water. But if they're sweating out a lot of salt, it can be helpful to add an electrolyte supplement in, which is where that information and kind of knowing that about yourself can be really helpful. So hopefully there continues to be more research and products and kind of toys that we can play with to really determine what each person needs.
When we talk about sports drinks versus water, just as a general topic, when should someone, I know we've sort of alluded to the times when a person might consider either sipping on a sports drink alongside water or potentially even swapping water with a sports drink. What are those specific times, if you had to list like your top 5 or 6 times that you should say, okay, really do think about sipping on a sports drink?
Okay, yeah. So there are 2 different categories of sports drinks too. We know that there are a lot of brands that are sugar-free. So they have the fluid and the electrolytes, but they don't have the extra carbohydrate. And then there's another category with just the regular, like full sugar, full electrolyte fluid option. So sports drinks can be very helpful because they accomplish a lot in just a small amount of liquid. So you get your fluids to help you rehydrate, you get your electrolytes to help you rehydrate, and then the carbohydrates come into play when we're looking at how long your activity is lasting. Also, potentially how intense your exercise is. So the longer you are sweating, the longer that you're exercising, and the longer or the more intense that your exercise is, the more we need those carbohydrates, which is where the carbohydrates in a sports drink and that sugar can really come into handy, because those are specifically formulated, for that purpose to give you a really fast acting, quick digesting source of energy. So usually I usually say as a general recommendation, that threshold is if you're exercising over an hour, then you might want to think about starting to sip on a regular sports drink so that you can get some additional carbohydrates, especially if your exercise is really intense. Because you will be relying more on carbohydrate for fuel and need more of that sugar. If you're exercising for less than an hour, but you're still sweating a lot, you're doing really intense exercise where your heart rate is up, you might want to consider either a sugar-free electrolyte drink or regular sports drink.
Got it. Okay, makes sense. Another question about electrolytes in our water. So for people who use or for people who drink filtered water, I'm wondering if there's any concern there. So for instance, I primarily fill my water bottle up from my refrigerator. So it's filtered water that comes through. And I've read or I've heard that electrolytes can be stripped out in this case. Sometimes even some of the minerals and things can. Obviously, the contaminants are stripped out, which is why we're using the filtered water. But do people need to worry if they're primarily drinking filtered water and try to replace electrolytes some other way?
I don't think they need to worry unless they're, losing a lot of fluid or, exercising heavily or, those different examples that we've discussed, just because there shouldn't be really a strong additional need for electrolytes that are, outside of your water, even if it is filtered, if you're not, doing some of those things. And we also do get some electrolytes from our food, which I think sometimes is forgotten. So if you're eating even a mildly salty food,
I'm sure we get a lot from our food.
We
At
do.
least sodium, I'm sure we get a lot. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. If you eat out, usually there is some level of sodium added to that just for flavor and, preserving the food and whatnot. And we can also get fluid from our food too. So those 2 kind of factors really go hand in hand, plus your water. You should be fine if you're, just going about your day. But if you add something in that's more strenuous where you are losing that fluid, then we might want to turn to some of those other products where the filtered water, really any type of water, it just wouldn't be enough.
That makes me feel better. I read that recently and was kind of like, whoa, most of my water is coming from my filtered refrigerator water.
Yeah,
So-
and there are some waters too that advertise to have electrolytes in them. So you really want to probably look at the label. Like if you're using those for replacing, what's lost, you want to look at the label, and it should have at least 200, 300 milligrams of sodium if you're using it to replace what you're losing.
What about pH with water? I've seen a lot of the kind of alkaline waters or pH balanced water. Electrolytes are important, but is the pH of the water we drink, is that important at all?
No, those are super trendy. I know exactly what you're talking about. Our body does a really good job just naturally regulating our pH. And so alkaline water versus, not as alkaline water, I look at it all in the same category. And so, one versus another is not necessarily better or worse. But yeah, those are definitely really hot right now.
Yeah. I was at a friend's house recently and they offered me one and I kind of was like, okay.
They do have a different taste though. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I can't really put my finger on what exactly it is,
Yeah.
but it's interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So we've talked a lot about water, getting enough water, I guess I should say. And to close out, I think really the last thing I wanted to talk about is too much water. Do we need to be worried about overhydrating in our lives? Is that common? Do these hydration products put us at risk for being overhydrated?
It is definitely something to think about. Like too much of anything, even if it's a good thing, can become a bad thing. If we're spreading our water intake out throughout the day and meeting our needs, we should be completely fine. But there are a lot of cases where, I always think of people who are, dieting or who are like, bodybuilders, for example, they're carrying around, a big jug of water and drinking a ton of water throughout the day. And if you're going way over your needs, you can overload the body and really dilute the sodium content that's in your bloodstream. And that's called hyponatremia, which can be really, really dangerous and life-threatening if that is happening. It is not very common, but it's still, a possibility, a very real possibility that people just need to be careful about. If, they're all of a sudden really increasing their water intake, you want to try to do that within a reasonable limit.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This was really great. I think it gives people a good landscape of what matters with hydration, what maybe doesn't, or maybe when it does matter, and things like that. So we really appreciate you coming in.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to chat.
Wow, there was a lot in your conversation that I hadn't even considered, especially about sweat. I sweat a lot myself, and I never really consider what's the best way to replenish what I've lost, or what have I even lost? So, the discussion here about you can go actually find out what you're sweating out and what you might need to replenish is interesting to me. I'm definitely going to look into that for myself. So I'm just, again, more knowledgeable about my own body.
Yeah, that whole thing is sort of wild to me. I had no idea. I knew you sweat out electrolytes. I just had literally no idea previously before talking to Emma about that the first time, that we all sweat out different amounts of these different electrolytes. I think it makes sense that we do. I just hadn't considered it. What I found really interesting, talking about the electrolyte packets, I've seen them a lot, and I did not realize how much sodium is in them. I've never looked, but I think, up to 500 milligrams of sodium in some of those packets, which that's a lot of salt. And I think since they taste good, and if you're just drinking them throughout the day, when you're just sitting at home, you're not even exercising or sweating, you're kind of just taking in a lot of extra salt. And we already live in a country where we probably eat way too much salt.
Right, exactly.
So it's just, adding fuel to the fire at that point. I thought it was interesting kind of putting that into a frame of context and really pointing out how much salt is in some of those packets. Yeah,
salt intake is always something that you're told is high just by default. And then hearing all this talk about salt, I was like, oh man, I got to be, you got to be careful about
exactly
about taking it at the right times or the wrong times or that sort of thing. And I've been trying to drift away from sports drinks and other kinds of drinks and get back to just water, plain old water, right? And you feel like you're being healthy when you're just drinking water, but sometimes your body might need a little more kick from something else.
Yeah, I think Emma made a really good point about when you should be choosing these electrolyte beverages and products and when you don't need to. And when you don't need to, they can be harmful. As far as plain old water, I think obviously it's just water. It doesn't taste great. It's kind of boring. So I understand the need and the want to kind of pick something that tastes better, like a sports drink or something. It was also interesting to talk about the alkaline water and how it's really no different from regular water. So truly it is plain old water for us, I think. That's plenty to hydrate us.
That's right, because after all, we are 70% water.
60% water.
70% water.
60% water.
all this talk of hydration, I think people equate liquid with hydrating.
That's a good point.
And that's not necessarily the case because you could be drinking coffee all day and dehydrating yourself.
Right. Yeah. It does get back to, it's just water that we need at the end of the day. Some of these other things inside the water can be good or bad. Caffeine, I think, as Emma mentioned, a cup here and there, hydrating. Coffee all day, probably dehydrating at that point. So it was interesting to hear that and kind of confirm that there's a lot of reasons we probably shouldn't be drinking coffee all day, and our hydration status is one of them.
Do you drink coffee all day?
I have 2 cups in the morning.
I don't drink coffee at all, so.
I don't understand that. I can't understand you right now.
I just drink water.
Right.
All right. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you guys enjoyed our topic today. That's going to do it for us this time. And be sure to share, like, and subscribe on Health with Houston Methodist, wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed this conversation, for more topics like this, visit our blog at houstonmethodist.org/blog. Stay tuned and stay healthy.
Houston Methodist Hospital has been named the best hospital in Texas for 11 years in a row by U.S. News & World Report. Houston Methodist Hospital is the #1 hospital in Texas and number 15 in the nation. We are nationally ranked in 10 specialties, the most in the state. For more than 100 years, we have provided you the best and safest clinical care, advanced technology, and patient experience. That's our promise of leading medicine. Houston Methodist, leading medicine.